Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. I would like to really thank Fadia for the organization of this event. It's, I think, a very significant thing to organize such an event, and I feel very privileged to be here with you this morning. I hope that my French accent won't prevent us to understand each other, and that the rhythmicity of my discourse and language won't be a barrier to mutual understanding. So, I would like to present to you today some of my current reflection around the rhythm and rhythm analysis based on my own background in the field of adult and higher education. So what I would like to do is I'm going to organize my presentation in two parts. First, I'm going to take some time to introduce the background, because I don't think I can take for granted that some of the praxis I'm going to refer to is familiar with your own. So I would like to take a few minutes to present that, and then in a second part share with you how I envision what rhythm analysis could be from an educational perspective. So I'm a psychosociologist by background. I'm working in the field of adult education. I'm teaching in higher education, and most of my work refer to the use of educational biography as a narrative approach. So I'm going to start with that so that you understand a bit some of the questions that I have, how they emerged, where they came from, and where they brought me. Most of what I'm going to share with you today is also inspired and grounded in research I've conducted during the last 10 years, which brought me to write and publish a book a few years ago that was titled Time and the Rhythms of Emancipatory Education, which kind of encapsulates some of the key themes that I'm interested in. So I came to rhythm analysis from my interest on time and the temporalities of education. And my position is that rhythm studies is a very privileged entry point to deal with the temporal dimensions of educational processes. Also, I'm from Switzerland, so my first language is French, and I'm kind of in between two cultures, teaching in the US, working in Switzerland, and so my familiarity with writings on rhythms, rhythm studies, and rhythm analysis is also enriched by resources that come from different linguistic fields. And so to go back to your question that you asked earlier about the emergence of rhythm analysis as a field, I think it raised question about social dynamics in higher education and science, and how right now some writings become more preeminent in English, where in France the trends are different in a way, and also the writings come from different places. Okay, so about my background, the background of my reflection, I mentioned earlier educational biography. When I started working in the field of adult education, my mentor, Pierre Dominici, was developing in the 80s and 90s an approach that he titled educational biography, to refer to a practice that has for aim to reflect with adult learners on their own life trajectory, life path, life history. And so we ask people, I conduct that, for instance, in the university with students, to narrate their own life. And either we usually start orally and then with a written format to write a narrative about the life history from the perspective of learning, education, development. What has been significant learning experiences for them? What has been significant developmental opportunities for them? So the idea is that, and it's both a research and training approach. It's a research approach because that's a way to collect, obviously, knowledge about what are significant experiences in people's life that participate to their development. But it's also a training approach, because by doing that, there are formative effects for the participant, because it raises awareness, consciousness about specific aspects of their life. So using that approach has many benefits, and first is that it gives a kind of complex picture of processes that are intertwined in the life of participants. It gives them access to those processes, and it gives researchers access to those processes. So again, it's an understanding of education not stressing the product of education, like knowledge or skills, but more stressing the processes that goes into educational dynamics. So it gives access to learning and transformational processes, and it opens up the possibilities to reinterpret the meaning given to past and present experiences, because those narratives are then read by the other participant in the group, and then we organize discussion that confront interpretation about how we understand and give meaning to the experience that have been lived by the participant. So that's the key benefit of the approach, but there are also some limitations, and that's where originates some of my interest also in rhythm analysis. First, and that has been clearly well theorized by Paul Ricoeur, when you work using narrative, you tend to build a plot. So basically what we ask people is to reflect on what they are going to integrate in the narrative to tell the story of their life, and therefore how they are going to organize the plot of their life. So it tends to stress the discontinuities that punctuate one's own life. It's most of the time organized around key events, often crises, dilemmas, ordeals, or epiphanies that are significant for the author of the narrative. And so the narrative is organized and punctuated by those kind of discontinuities. Doing so, it tends to neglect ordinary experiences and the everyday life. So usually you don't find so much in life histories account about habits, routines, rituals, things that get repeated on a everyday basis, or even on a larger time scale, because repetition tend to be ignored, and it's not something purposeful, it's kind of linked to the device of writing narrative. So singular events appear more preeminent than repetitive experiences. And so in my own research, because I'm interested to understand better how to conceive transformative processes, observing that limitation led me to raise new questions about how can I get access to those aspects in our life that actually are redundant or repetitive, either in the everyday life or at a larger scale. So I'd like to share with you here a few assumptions that I have about how I conceive transformation throughout the lifespan, and what I'm trying to develop, what I've done in the book. I was more interested into emancipation as a specific transformative process, and so the idea was to develop a conception of emancipation as a rhythmic process. Emancipation is not just a state that you reach one day in your life and then after you are done. It's obviously a matter of struggle. It's made of tension, so it kind of has to be sustained. And I do believe that it's kind of similar for other forms of transformation that can affect adults. So transformation tend to be reduced to the experiences of discontinuity that shape them. And again, we often refer to event, rupture, crisis, epiphany as key events that we identify to transformation. And when you ask people to provide with a metaphor, the butterfly is often the metaphor that come to mind, with those key transformations that are experienced from the caterpillar to the chrysalis to the butterfly itself. However, when you look actually very carefully at how a butterfly come to life, and you can look online, if you look at my blog, you'll see some videos. It's very interesting to see that it's actually a rhythmic process. It's made of movement that are invisible to the naked eye, so you have to use video in order to grasp them, but it's made of contraction, it's made of change that occur in the body of the caterpillar first, the chrysalis then, that eventually lead to the opening of the chrysalis and the opening of the wings of the butterfly. But those specific moments are actually made of very small changes that are kind of invisible. And I do believe it's the same for the way we change and transform ourselves as human beings. So transformation involves processes that are inscribed in duration. And I like to refer here to the French philosopher François Julien, who called those silent transformation. Silent because they are invisible in a way, because we don't hear them or we don't see them except when something more preeminent emerges. So as much as they appear through discontinuity, transformations also emerge from ongoing, continuous and repetitive processes. And they involve, we can grasp them at different scale of time. They involve scripts, routines, rituals, discourses, feelings, gestures, psychological state or social interactions that are repeated throughout the everyday life. I have 2 young children, and my everyday life right now is made of the repetition of the same routines with them, because they need that in order to grow and find balance. For me as an adult, it's sometimes very difficult because it's kind of very repetitive. But at the same time, I see how those routines kind of change through very little variation day after day and eventually bring to deeper transformation. Now, another way to conceive the rhythmic aspect of transformation is also with situations that reappear throughout the life course. For example, professional transitions, especially if today, people have more than one work throughout their life, and so we repeat what Lefebvre would call a specific moment of one's life that's made of, for example, professional transition, health conditions, the way we also live through relationships. All those kind of moments of our life built up through specific repetition, and transformation emerge from the evolution of those moments. So transformation display behaviors that repeat themselves and that fluctuate over time. And that brings me to a definition of the rhythm. Rhythms, you may know it, comes from the ancient Greek rhythmos, a form that fluctuates, a form in movement. So I would like now to just give, there was a question earlier asked about how do we define a rhythm, and I found it very useful in my work to refer to the work of Pierre Sauvanet, who is a French philosopher who wrote his thesis 20 years ago, published it in 2 volumes. One is called Rhythmology, the other one is called Rhythmanalysis, where he basically drew a survey of rhythm theories, mostly in philosophy and aesthetics, and raising issues about the fact that often in rhythm studies there is a risk of what he called fall into panrhythmia, the fact we find a rhythm everywhere, because everything kind of may manifest rhythm. That doesn't mean that we are talking about the same thing when we are talking about biological rhythm, about the rhythm of the sea, or about the rhythm of a crowd in a social space. So he suggests 3 criteria to take into consideration to try to fine-tune a bit what we are talking about. And to introduce them, I use that painting that unfortunately doesn't appear very well here from Paul Klee called Rhythmics. And so in this painting, I'm going to go very fast here, but it's just to give you those 3 criteria. The first things that we can see from a rhythmic point of view is the presence of patterns. So patterns for him is the first criterion, and there are different kind of patterns. There is color patterns here. There is a succession of black, gray, and white shape. There is also patterns that are linked to the presence of this kind of square-like shape. There are patterns that have to do with the repetition of lines in this kind of chessboard display. So pattern is the first element that we may find when we study rhythm. The second aspect has to do with the repetition. He called that periodicity. And obviously here we have the repetition of that pattern, black, gray, and white, black, gray, and white, and so on, and the repetition of the lines. So periodicity refers to the presence of a frequency, of a period, eventually a tempo, that characterize the way a pattern is repeated. And eventually the last aspect, he called it the movement, that refer to, in a way, the most non-intuitive aspect of the rhythm, the variation, the difference, and the fact that here it's not a chessboard game, it's clearly shapes that evolve and don't have exactly the same form, and so there is variation, there is discontinuity. And so for him, wherever we find at least 2 out of those 3 criteria, we may identify a rhythm. So pattern, periodicity, and movement. And so from that point of view, I do believe that we can think about transformation, whether they are historical or biographical. We can try to describe them, if we conceive them as rhythmic, based on the pattern that they may display, based on the way they repeat themselves, but also considering the discontinuity, the variation that they may also display. So in the book, I developed the idea that emancipation can be approached through the patterns that contribute to it. So I was basing my analysis on the life history of a former student of mine, and without getting here into the detail, what I identify as a key pattern in our own development is the pattern of transgression. So the action of transgressing, something that we actually learn very early in one's life. I mean, children age 2 or 3 already transgress pretty well. And then eventually it gets either inhibited or reinforced by their education, and then we develop and we enrich the pattern of transgression. And eventually that can lead to experience throughout one's life that have obviously much more significance. So there is patterns, there is a periodicity, and obviously the life history is never the repetition of the same. So there are events, accidents, what Sauvanet calls syncope. It's a disruption that eventually renew the rhythm that we can observe. So that's for the first part. So from there, what does it mean and how does that inform my understanding of rhythm analysis as an educational practice? So how to conceive first the aims of rhythm analysis from an educational perspective? And here I like to refer to different authors. Obviously Lefebvre come to mind, and from a critical perspective, I do believe that critical pedagogy rely at least on 6 functions: capacity to discriminate, to interpret, to evaluate, to argue, to judge, and to challenge phenomena, either lived or observed. And so I do believe that we can conceive rhythm analysis as an educational practice that brings people, learners, to develop this capacity to discriminate, interpret, evaluate, argue, judge, and challenge the rhythms that are constitutive of their own experience. So we can here refer to the distinction that Lefebvre evoke around arrhythmia, polyrhythmia, and eurythmia as 3 forms of relations between rhythms. And here I like also to refer to Pascal Michon, who is another French philosopher and historian who has extensively written about rhythm in the last few years, who suggests to distinguish, for him, rhythms refer to rhythmos, to des manières de fluer. It's a way of flowing, if you want. And they can be discursive, they can be embodied, they can be psychological, based on our mood, state of mind, and they can be social, based on the way social interaction evolve. So at any of this level of interpretation, we can pay attention to arrhythmia, when rhythms conflict, are in dissonance with each other; polyrhythmia, when they coexist without necessarily being in sync with each other; or eurythmia, when we observe or experience a feeling of cohesion that reinforce a feeling of resonance, that reinforce the experience of rhythms that co-evolve. So that's one first way to think about rhythm analysis from an educational perspective. But the one I would like to stress is actually located at another level. And I would like here to refer to Barthes, and I know there is a presentation this afternoon around idiorhythmy, so I'm not going to develop that. But Barthes referred to this notion of idiorhythmy to evoke the capacity that people have, either individually or in community, to assert their own idiosyncratic rhythms. And so we could develop, from a temporal and rhythmic perspective, emancipation as the capacity to assert the rhythms that characterize our very own self, our own community. And so from that perspective, rhythm analysis may have as an aim to learn, to help people learn to find, develop, and above all, sustain such idiorhythmy. It can be in the everyday life, so it's about asserting one's own rhythm in the everyday life, fighting against what a colleague of mine calls schizophrenia, the experience of temporal divide, the fact that we are experiencing conflicting temporalities in the everyday life. There is a time of work, the time of family, the time of study, the time of production. And so idiorhythmy there is the capacity for each individual or group or community to find cohesion, eurythmia, and assert rhythms that are cohesive. And there is another way to conceive idiorhythmy, and here I'm more informed and inspired by Gaston Bachelard, the French philosopher of science. Bachelard was actually the first one to introduce the notion of rhythm analysis in French. And he referred, Bachelard was interested into the development of science and ideas, and for him, history of science is made of discontinuity, and rhythm occurs when we are able to connect such discontinuities. And for him, the human development could be conceived in the same way. So in a way, we could conceive idiorhythmy, according to Bachelard's view, as the capacity to sustain the rhythm of one's own development throughout the lifespan. So somewhere there is this idea that we reproduce patterns, way of being throughout our life. We also experience tensions between different aspects of our life, and being able to connect them and to make them cohesive contribute to some form of self-development. And maybe we can conceive rhythm analysis in connection to that phenomenon. So what could be the focus of rhythm analysis from an educational perspective? Well, I guess the first answer would be to consider everyday situations. Discourses, embodied activity, feelings, state of mind, social relations. That's obviously a point of entry to start paying attention to the rhythms that make us. Now, I think that in Lefebvre, one aspect of his contribution that is very important is his theory of moment. And that's mostly in La Somme et le Reste, which I don't know if has been translated in English. And also he started developing his theory of moment in the Critique of Everyday Life, I think the second or the third volume. And so the concept of moment for Lefebvre referred to a specific experience that is invested by the subject. It's not any kind of situation. It's the fact that we choose consciously to invest in our life moments, experiences that are meaningful and that eventually build themselves up through repetition. So for example, I was mentioning my kids earlier. The moment of parenthood is a moment I'm very invested in right now in my life. And it's a moment that emerges obviously when children are born, but it actually starts much earlier. In a way, I could see myself as a child observing my parents and already start projecting myself what I will do when I will become a father. So the moment of parenthood is not necessarily attached to the fact that we become actually a parent. It can start, the seeds may be there earlier, but eventually it becomes more intense at specific stage of one's life, especially when children appear. And so then it's invested. Then it's an experience. Obviously, I'm not just a parent. So it's a one moment of my life right now in parallel with other moments that I'm investing, my work, maybe leisure time or social life. But that's a moment that is made out of the repetition of specific experiences that are characterized by their own rhythms. So there is the rhythms that compose specific moments. I was mentioning the rhythms of the repetition of specific activity with my kids earlier. That's one example. And then this moment obviously repeats itself. It's not a continuum uninterrupted. So the moment is built through its own repetition. And throughout one's life, there is obviously moments which are more intense, more moments which have a lower intensity. So I do believe that moments is a key entry point to think to apply a rhythm analytical perspective. For Lefebvre, some moments becomes alienating when we become prisoner of specific experience whose rhythms take over our life. And I think the best example that I like to give is compulsive activity, whether if addiction, for example. Because the moment of, when a moment that can be normal, like eating, like consuming alcohol, which everybody may do, becomes proeminent in one's life and take over, then through addiction, then that moment becomes something that makes us prisoner of some specific experience because of the compulsion to it. And so rhythm analysis is another way to think about how we relate to different moments of one's life, those that we consciously choose to invest and those that we may eventually suffer from their hegemony. The last aspect I'm going to mention here, I totally lost track of time. Okay, so I'm going to finish with that. To go back to Bachelard, patterns of duality. For Bachelard, the way we evolve is made of tension between polarities that constitute our life, meaningful tension that evolve throughout the lifespan. I was mentioning earlier emancipation. Emancipation is an emergence from tensions that we all live all the time between autonomy and dependence. And so there are times in our life where we are feeling empowered, autonomous, free, and some others where we feel highly dependent, relying on others, or eventually alienated by others. So there is a fluctuation there, so there is a rhythm there. So in the terms of Bachelard, I would call that a pattern of duality because we fluctuate between different poles of our experience. It can be between success and failure, between feeling self-confident or lacking self-confidence, between moving, traveling, immigrating, or staying in the same place, and so on. So another way, which I think for me is the more promising in my own work right now, is to try to identify, using life narrative, but also eventually other methodologies, way to access how we develop ourselves as adults throughout our life through such kind of dualities, and how we learn to fluctuate and how we learn to regulate, because that's the educational issue there, to be able to consciously regulate how we move from one place to another in our own way of being in the world. And so I've developed the idea in a recent publication that's going to be published soon of rhythmic unconscious to refer to those kind of pattern of duality, because often we are not very aware of such kind of repetition. If I ask you to write a life history about talking about self-confidence or lack of self-confidence, you are going to refer to events in your life where you feel very confident, or at the opposite, where you lost confidence in yourself. But being able to keep track of how self-confidence fluctuates throughout one's life is something very difficult. That's why I refer to this idea of unconscious, of rhythmic unconscious, because we may have to invent new way to grasp and identify this kind of rhythmicity. So I guess I'm going to finish here. I'm going to skip that part. That was my last slide, and invite you to keep in touch if you want to move on with the dialogue. Thank you for your attention and your time.